Hello students, happy Thursday. I'm recording this actually on Wednesday to get it posted for you. First of all, I gotta tell you how much I miss you all. I really miss my A pushers. But you've been working really hard, so the next couple of days on Thursday and Friday is going to be very short for your assignments. I'm sure you're kind of overwhelmed like all of us are with all the things you have to do. So I'm going to cut this short and make it short and sweet. I appreciated your HIPPO documents on essentially McCarthyism. Some of them you embedded like what the document was, and some of them you did not, and so that was a little difficult to try to decipher. But I didn't make that clear, so it's definitely not your fault. You see these pumpkins here. Funny story about the trial of Alger Hiss. If you ever want to take a look at it, he was a State Department official who was tried and sentenced, and apparently he was hiding secret documents out in his pumpkin patch, and they were discovered from that. But anyway, so I want to get on today with the Vietnam War. I had a poll out there to see if you wanted to do some analyzing of a book or analyzing of a document series called The Vietnam War by Ken Burns. Right now the polls are still out. Actually, I'm thinking of maybe just letting you choose and do whichever one you want. But that'll come next week. I just want to make this short and simple for this week. So this letter B is what I want to focus on today. Although anti-communist foreign policy faced little domestic opposition in previous years, the Vietnam War inspired sizable and passionate anti-war protests that became more numerous as the war escalated and sometimes led to violence. Now I have to give you a little bit of background, got to do a little contextualization. Remember, after Eisenhower is president, Kennedy becomes president, and Kennedy is the youngest president that the United States had ever had. He's very charismatic. He had been in World War II, and he's basically kind of given a proxy war. Now, it doesn't seem like, oh, well, we weren't in Vietnam in 1955 under Eisenhower, but we kind of were. The stop of communism that was happening with these proxy wars is kind of just handed down from one president to another. And Kennedy was really unhappy with the way South Vietnam's president, he was kind of like a dictator, was handling things. Well, he was overthrown in a coup. And it actually kind of it made America look pretty bad, like we had something to do with the coup. Now, we didn't, but ironically, 3 weeks after that happens, Kennedy is assassinated himself. And so now President Johnson gets Vietnam. And we are definitely, taking part in Vietnam by 1965. The Operation Rolling Thunder was going on in the 1965, 66, 67. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was in 1964. So in 1965, a lot of people are getting more involved in understanding what the Vietnam War is all about. Teach-ins were basically, and you can see this picture right here, they were conducted by students and faculty at large campuses, campuses around the United States. University of Michigan was a big one. University of Wisconsin was a big one. UC Berkeley out in California was a big one. And so it kind of starts to spread. And they basically got together, all these young people, your age or just a little bit older, young people got together and said, what is this all about? Because these young people would have very much been affected by the Vietnam War. So hawks versus doves. In 1965, there was a lot more hawks, and hawks were people who supported the war. They were basically supporters of the Vietnam War, and doves were those who did not support the war. In 1965, it's definitely a 2-to-1 ratio where there's a lot more hawks. As things begin to change and as the tide begins to turn, we will see that pretty soon the American understanding is that this war cannot be won. This is an ideological war that we can't win. And there's a lot more doves. especially 1968. And that's what I wanted to bring up in the credibility gap. The credibility gap is this now public skepticism about LBJ, about Johnson. And if he was like actually being honest and letting the press know really what was going on. Now keep in mind, we could do a fantastic CCOT here, change in continuity over time. When we look back at Roosevelt's presidency, FDR's presidency, he really used the media to his advantage with the fireside chats. By 1965, there is a television in every house in America, and now the television is what is changing the course of events. Whereas before you would have only had maybe a few reporters coming on the radio, now you have many reporters all over the place coming on television. Now, granted, there were only a few channels, but this is really changing public opinion. And so Johnson's credibility and assurance that we're going to win this war is going to go down. In fact, as we go on later, Johnson has a Great Society program, a social program that he very much wants to see happen. And he in order for that to get him elected, when he runs for election, after he finishes out Kennedy's term, he says, well, our boys aren't going to go to Vietnam, probably knowing that they will. So the Fulbright hearings are happening about this time. Fulbright was an Arkansas senator, and he's the one leading these hearings, and they are publicized, they're televised. At first, he'd supported the war, and then he leads these congressional hearings to oppose the war. And so people are watching this on TV. I cannot explain to you enough how important television was in the Vietnam War era and how it changed public attitude and opinion. Having said that, I want you to watch a real quick little video on what was happening at the Democratic National Convention in 1968. By the way, you see that Students for a Democratic Society and Columbia University protests in 1968. 1968 is a turning point in the Vietnam War. Up until then, it was probably winnable. We didn't really give it a lot of thought. Maybe there weren't such a increase of troops into Vietnam. By 1968, the tide has changed. Now, not unironically, what happens in January of 1968? If you remember from the last chat I had with you, it was the Tet Offensive, and the Tet Offensive completely caught us, the United States, off guard. So let me show you this quick little video of the Democratic National Convention happening that summer in Chicago.
On August 26, Democrats convene in Chicago to nominate their candidate for president. 10,000 anti-war protesters also turn up.
20,000 police and National Guard circled these demonstrators, and they then spent time taunting each other. Until the whole event became explosive. Protesters challenged police,
Protesters, journalists, local residents, and even members of the clergy are beaten by police. They use so much tear gas, it seeps into the lobby of the Hilton Hotel.
There was just this pervasive sense of a nation at tension with itself, that the forces were beginning to tear the American people apart.
After contentious debate, Hubert Humphrey wins the nomination. But a divided Democratic Party will make for a Republican victory in November when Richard Nixon is elected president.
Okay, so we're back here. I wanted you to see that because it was a very violent eruption. People are getting really, really anxious, and a lot of it, once again, is coming from young people, people who are just a little bit older than you, who are facing the reality of going off to war. My dad in 1968 just barely, probably missed the draft, essentially. So there was a point when if you were in college that you would not be part of the draft. And my dad, when basically it was his turn, he was in college, and so he was exempted from going. And then it was shortly after that they lifted that exemption and said, doesn't matter if you're a college student, you're going to go to war if you are drafted. And so my father barely, missed the draft time. His friends were not necessarily so lucky, and I truly wish we were together in school, because we had a panel of Vietnam veterans going to come in fact, on Friday, on April 4th. And they were going to talk to us about their experiences, and it is truly, truly moving. Next year, I hope and pray things are back to normal. Next year, seniors will do it again. Mrs. Brock sets it up. She's fantastic. She invites my junior A pushers to come as well. And you'll get a lot of information. But there's tons of stories. If you went to war, whether you wanted to or not, then all of a sudden you were lumped into this category of being, the enemy, and on the other side against people who didn't have to go to war, or who were anti-war protesters. So 1968 is definitely a turning point in it. And as I just talked about, we just saw that on the Democratic National Convention. I want to skip down there to Woodstock. That's a picture on the top left of Woodstock. This was the biggest kind of celebration in music, I guess I would say, in New York. But it was so much more than music. This was a time when people came together to kind of live life, because life was so precariously unbalanced at the time. And so Woodstock was the legendary concert venue, if you would. So then the exposure of the My My massacre. So it's pronounced My Lai, and there's a picture of it down there. In 1968, war is hell. This is an old expression, and anybody who tells you any different is going to be a liar. And people have to do the unthinkable, including people who are morally good. And in 1968, there was a massacre of a small village including South Vietnamese, who should have been on the same side. And eventually it gets publicized. It gets brought to light. And the atrocities that the American soldiers did in My Lai are exposed for the world. And these are the kind of images then that are coming across television and in newspapers. And people start saying, what in the world are we doing? This is wrong. This is no good. So the Pentagon Papers, this is in 1969. It was a military study of really the whole entire war, of how the war was going, of the amount of the economic costs were absolutely staggering, and they were saying of what it would continue to cost, the amount of troops that would be needed. And these Pentagon Papers got leaked out. It got copied and sent to the New York Times, and the New York Times published it for the American public. And there was outrage. They could not believe that the government was covering up and not shedding light on truly what was going on. There was a lot of secrecy happening. By 1970, Kent State, these were student protests of the bombing in Cambodia. in Kent State, Ohio, yes, Indiana, Ohio, there were student protests, and a lot of students, well, not a lot, but several students were killed. They were shot because they were protesting. And you know, that's one of the rights, but it was a heated altercation between students and police. The same thing happened at Jackson State. Jackson State does not get nearly as much publicity or mention because the students at Jackson State were mostly Black Americans, African American students. And so these are a couple, like, okay, when it got to the point, it was bad at the DNC, at the convention in Chicago, but now when kids are being shot on campus for protesting against something that they see as completely useless and not warranted, now things are changing. So the only thing I want you to do, and your instructions will be listed on the calendar. I spoke really fast. I showed you the video. If there's anything that you had a question about, if you have a comment about, if you can bring up some, okay, I heard this, can you tell us more? I'm gonna make a Padlet. I would ask you to post it there and respond to at least one other student. So that's it. Have a great weekend. Talk to you later. Bye.